Hi there, and welcome back to the latest series on our project to build a flexible and dynamic application using C#, Web APIs and Azure. So in the last video we created an API controller that used our repository interfaces and generic repositories to perform CRUD operations on a model table. In that point it was the application model. So now we need to hook up the other data models in the same way. So we've got our data model, our data property, schema and schema property. And what we could do is we could pretty much just copy and paste this application controller and just go through where we've got application. We could update it to be, say, data model, for example, and then just go through the entire thing, updating everything, because a lot of these endpoints actually don't work directly on the model. That could actually quite work, and we could just update the actual data models here, and so we could just create and repeat everything through there. The problem with doing that is it isn't very efficient or very modular. And what I mean by this is if we needed to change, say, the underlying repository itself, maybe we wanted to add a few new methods or something like that, well then it means we'd have to go into each individual controller and update them accordingly, so it's perhaps not the best way of doing it. Luckily we've already fixed a similar problem when we created the repository class, i.e. we use generics, where we have obviously the single class and then we throw different models at it and the class wraps itself the model that we're using. With the repository class, as I said, we're reusing that model each time, and then we use the dependency injection to inject it in. And although we could do this with the controllers, it actually becomes a little bit more complex. So we kind of want a bit of a half and halfway house. So what I generally do is I create a separate, what I call a base controller, that uses the same generic pattern that we used in the repository. And then we pass the model into it. But what we do is we then create the individual controllers that we actually want that inherit from that controller. So there's still a certain amount of copying and pasting in, but it's a lot simpler and not as much needed to do it. And if we do need to update the underlying controller, we just update that base controller and everything else just updates automatically. The added benefit of doing this is if we did need to add additional API endpoints for any particular API controller, or if we needed to override and update the implementation, it's a lot easier to do that in this method. So it's a lot easier by example. So let's go ahead and get this done. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is in our Web API project, I'm going to create a new controller. I'm going to use this empty controller option here, and we're going to call it base controller. So that creates our basic empty structure controller. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over to my common patterns library. Now there's two ways you could do this. What you could in theory do is go to our applications controller that we've just built, and we could copy and paste all that out of there. But what I'm going to do is I've also put it in my common patterns project in GitHub, so just in case you can't remember, it's github.com/completecoder, and then go to the common patterns project. So go into there, complete coder common, go to the web API and go to the simple base controller, and then what we can do is we can just copy and paste all that out of there. Go into here and just paste that over the top. As before, what we've had to do, because we just need to change this round because we've got that differently. So rather than base entity, it's entity base. We'll need to resolve that, of course. We'll need to also resolve these as well so that it knows what the iRepository is. And let's just change that from simple base controller to base controller. So everything should be fine there. Oh, and we just need to resolve the Swagger. So this has got all pretty much the same endpoints as we had before. The difference is at the top of the class we've got this using generic, so we're saying every time we use an instance of this base controller we're going to pass in a T entity which will be a model, and we're saying that that model is going to be based on entity base, and then again we will have an internal iRepository, and then we'll use dependency injection to take whatever that actual concrete implementation is and pass it through. So once we've done that we can save that, and let's go back to our application controller, and so we're going to update this. So at the moment it's inheriting from API controller, and we're going to change that to be base controller, and because this is going to be our application model we need to tell it that that's what it's using. Because of that we can get rid of this private call there. We'll get rid of that there. There's an error but we'll come back to that in a minute, and then we can get rid of all this code in here completely. We're wanting this repository to be passed through. Let's just update that. What we do is we use this, we do colon and then base and then open some brackets, and then what this allows us to do is pass the repository that we're injecting through here through to the base underlying controller. And that's then pretty much it. As you can see it's very simple as the controller. In fact we can get rid of these because these are no longer needed, and it's a very lightweight, very simple controller. And as we said, if we wanted to add any additional endpoints that would be applicable to everything, we could just add endpoints into this class and this controller automatically inherits all those. So now we've done that, we need to go and do the same thing for our other models. So we want the data model, data property, schema and schema property. So I'm just going to quickly run through and we're going to add some controllers. Again I'm going to use the web API 2 as the base just for the scaffolding. So we will have data model, and what I'll do is I'll just create them all first and then go through and update them. So once that's done, as we say, what I'll do is let's just go back to our application controller, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy and paste that there, and then for each of them I'm just going to go and paste that into there. And then finally we'll just update each of these to use the model that we want it to use. So that's that one. But what I'm actually just going to do, I'm just going to copy these in so that we don't need to keep doing the resolving all the way through. Then all we actually have to worry about is putting this in. And so that's all our controllers created. While I'm here, I'm just going to do a bit of cleaning up. I'm just going to delete this values controller because we no longer need that. And then the final thing we have to do is tell dependency injection that we are using these additional repositories. So go into in your web API, go into your app start folder and unity config. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy that, paste it 4 times for each of my other repositories and update them accordingly. So just to recap, we are registering our repositories using the generic repository, SQL repository, and telling it which data model to use. That is going to be using the base controller, so this has got all our endpoints generated and it's one to take in an iRepository of some sort of model that inherits from entity base. What I will just point out actually is that each of these endpoints is a public virtual. Now the virtual keyword will allow us to actually override any of these calls within the class themselves. So once we've got our base controller and we have all our individual controllers, as I say, they're all inherited, but that virtual keyboard actually means we can then use a public override, and then that allows us to override any of these actual implementations if we wish to. So once that's all done, let's build the project. And then view it. As before, we can then go to the Swagger endpoint and all our controllers now listed. First of all, let's just check to make sure our original controller is working, which was the applications one. And there we can see we can get back the application object that we created earlier. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this ID, because what I'm going to do now is, just to make sure the other controllers work, I'm going to create a schema definition. So we'll start this out. So we're going to do a post. Let's just copying the model there. Now I'm not going to input any schema properties and I'm not going to input an ID. What I do need to do is paste in my application ID there, and then we'll create the name. So we'll start creating a custom model object here. Let's click try it out, and that's created it. And then if we go to the get and click try it out, and again it will retrieve all the result sets. Now just to be aware, sometimes when you do this you might get an error in the response body and it will be complaining about the database connection already being open. If you do get that, all you need to do is go to your web.config for your web API, and in your connection string at the end here we want to add multiple active result sets equals true, and this basically just tells Entity Framework that it can have multiple database connection strings open. So let's just go back and try that again, make sure we've put that string in correctly, and yes, we've got it all. So as you can see, we've been able to create all our API controller endpoints now that all have our common CRUD operations in to create, update, get all, get by ID and delete, and it was nice and quick. And if we do need to update and add any additional endpoints, it's very quick and easy to do and control. Hope you'll enjoy me in the next video. In the next one we're going to actually publish this to an Azure API app, and then in the episode after that we'll actually start building a UI around it using Angular.